Arriving home on a cold night, a millionaire found an 8-year-old girl sleeping, frightened, in the garden tool shed. Moved by compassion, he brought her inside the mansion, where his wife, confined to a wheelchair for 3 years after a devastating accident, questioned the unknown child. The next day, upon returning from work, he witnessed a scene that made him break down in tears. The cold, dense fog clung to the estate's gardens like a shroud of secrets, swallowing the outlines of perfectly pruned rose bushes and silencing the outside world. For Arthur Sterling, a man whose name was synonymous with fortune and power on Wall Street, the fog was merely a reflection of the one that had settled over his own soul 3 long years ago. The headlights of his luxury sedan cut through the darkness of the oak-lined driveway, illuminating the imposing facade of stone and glass, a monument to his success, but also a gilded cage. He killed the engine but remained in the vehicle's silence, the weight of another day of board meetings, stock trades, and managing a fortune that seemed to grow of its own accord, pressing down on his shoulders. All that money, all the assets and holdings were worthless before the one door he most dreaded crossing, the door to his wife Eleanor's bedroom. Tonight, however, something was different. A faint, trembling light flickered in the garden shed at the far end of the lawn, a forgotten place he hadn't visited in months. Curiosity, as sharp as an investor sniffing out an opportunity, overrode his exhaustion. He stepped out of the car, the cold air raising goosebumps on his skin beneath the expensive suit. His Italian leather shoes sank slightly into the damp grass as he walked, his heart pounding with a strange apprehension. The shed door was ajar. He pushed it slowly, the groan of old wood the only sound in the silent night. Inside, the smell of damp earth and rust mingled with something else. Fear. Huddled in a corner, atop a pile of old burlap sacks, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 8. Her face smudged with grime, her hair matted, and her clothes so torn they barely protected her from the cold. She was asleep, a restless sleep, shivering under the weak beam of an old failing flashlight. Arthur's instinct, the multi-millionaire accustomed to solving problems with a single phone call, was to summon security. This was trespassing, a breach of protocol. But he paused. There was a vulnerability in that small form that disarmed all his rigidity. She was so small, so fragile amidst the rusted shovels and rakes. He stepped closer, and the sound of his footsteps on the concrete floor startled her awake. The girl's eyes flew open, a pair of terrified stars in the darkness. She shrank back, hugging her knees, her entire body trembling not just from the cold, but from pure dread. It was a fear Arthur knew well. Not the fear of losing money on the stock market, but the deep, paralyzing fear of someone who had already come to expect the worst from the world. He saw in her eyes the certainty that he would throw her out, perhaps with yelling, perhaps with force. "It's okay," he said, his voice emerging softer than he'd intended, a tone he hadn't used since Eleanor had stopped smiling. "I'm not going to hurt you." He knelt, keeping his distance so as not to frighten her further. "Are you hungry?" The girl just stared, silent tears beginning to trace clean paths down her dirty face. She didn't answer, didn't make a single sound. The refusal to speak, the intensity of her silence, said more than any words. She was running from something terrible. Arthur felt a knot form in his throat. He couldn't just send her away, back into the cold night and whatever was hunting her. Compassion, a force he usually kept under lock and key, broke through his defenses. Making the most illogical decision of his life, he held out his hand. "Come on, you can stay inside tonight. It's warm in there." After a hesitation that seemed to last an eternity, the girl, driven by desperation, took his hand. It was tiny and ice-cold. He led her out of the shed, through the misty garden, toward the warm lights of the main house. Every step was a risk, a break in his carefully controlled routine. As they entered the marble foyer, under the glow of a crystal chandelier worth more than most suburban homes, the girl looked up, her mouth agape. Arthur felt the weight of what he was doing. He needed to hide her, at least until morning, so as not to disturb Eleanor. Silently, he guided her toward the guest wing, but as his foot touched the first step of the grand staircase, a soft, melancholic voice echoed from the top of the stairs. "Arthur, is that you? Who's with you?" The sound of Eleanor's voice, as soft and fragile as a crystal note, froze Arthur at the foot of the stairs. It was the voice he loved, but one that now carried the constant echo of pain and resignation. He looked up and saw her at the top of the grand staircase, her delicate silhouette seated in the motorized wheelchair that had become her extension. The hallway light behind her created a halo in her blonde hair, making her look like a captive angel. The little girl, still clutching Arthur's hand, hid behind his leg, a small, frightened animal seeking refuge. "It's just an unexpected guest, my love," Arthur stammered, hating the weakness in his own voice. He, who commanded boardrooms with billionaires and negotiated the futures of entire companies, felt like a helpless boy under his wife's gaze. Eleanor guided her chair to the edge of the landing, her eyes fixed not on him, but on the small figure hiding behind him. There was suspicion in her face, yes, but also a flicker of curiosity Arthur hadn't seen in a very long time. It was a spark of life in the midst of her apathy. A guest? At this hour? Arthur? And who might that be? She asked, her tone lacking the acidity he expected, replaced by a calm that was almost more unnerving. He took a deep breath, knowing that half-truths would only make things worse. "I found her in the garden. She was cold. I couldn't leave her out there." The simplicity of the truth seemed to hang in the mansion's opulent air. Eleanor tilted her head, studying the scene. The silence stretched, tense and heavy. Finally, she spoke, her voice still a whisper. "She looks hungry. Take her to the kitchen." And that was it. No more questions, no objections. She maneuvered her wheelchair and disappeared back into the darkness of the hallway, leaving Arthur stunned. The surprise of her reaction threw him off balance more than any confrontation would have. He looked down at the girl, who peeked out from behind his leg, her eyes wide with relief. "What's your name?" he asked gently. The girl hesitated, then whispered so quietly he could barely hear, "Leah." In the kitchen, a vast, modern space that contrasted with the classic style of the rest of the house, Arthur made a sandwich and poured a glass of warm milk. He felt clumsy, his movements uncertain. It had been years since he'd prepared anything for anyone but himself. Leah sat at the enormous island counter, her small legs dangling, unable to reach the floor. She ate with a restrained voracity, as if afraid the food might be snatched away at any moment. Arthur watched in silence, his heart aching. All his wealth, his immense net worth accumulated over years of shrewd investments, seemed ridiculous and useless in the face of this child's simple hunger. What good was a positive cash flow and rising dividends if he couldn't ease the terror in one child's eyes? When she finished, he tried again, in the calmest voice he could manage. "Leah, where did you come from? Do your parents know where you are?" The reaction was instant. The brief glimmer of comfort on Leah's face vanished, replaced by the same mask of terror he'd seen in the shed. She shook her head vigorously, her eyes filling with tears again. "No, please," she mumbled, her voice thick. "Don't make me go back." Go back where? To whom? The questions burned in Arthur's mind, but he saw that pushing her would only cause more pain. He nodded, backing off. "All right, you don't have to go back. You're safe here." Later, he settled her into a guest room, a space larger than any place she had likely ever slept. He swapped the silk sheets for simpler cotton ones and tucked her into the soft bed. She curled up under the covers, looking even smaller in the immense mattress. He left a nightlight on and gently closed the door. When he turned, his heart leaped. Eleanor was there, waiting for him in the silent hallway, the expression on her face an unreadable mixture of sadness and an intensity he couldn't decipher. "She reminds me of you," Arthur, Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the silence. The way she looks at the world, as if she expects it to crumble at any moment. Eleanor's observation hit him like a punch. She reminds me of you. Arthur stood frozen in the lavish hallway, the Persian rug beneath his feet suddenly feeling like an abyss. He didn't know what to say. Eleanor had a gift for seeing through his defenses, for touching the wounds he tried so hard to hide under layers of success and control. It was true. Since the accident, he had lived with the constant feeling that the floor could give way at any moment, that the fragile stability he had built for Eleanor could shatter. The girl, Leah, was an unexpected mirror to his own tormented soul. "She's just a scared kid, Eleanor," he replied, his voice a little harsher than he intended, an automatic defense mechanism. Eleanor was unfazed. She maneuvered her chair closer, the electric motor a soft whir in the night's stillness. "All scared children need a safe place, Arthur. You know that better than anyone." With those cryptic words, she turned and moved slowly toward their bedroom, leaving him alone with his tumultuous thoughts. The next morning, Arthur woke before dawn, a habit forged by years of tracking the opening of the Asian markets. His first concern, however, wasn't his crypto portfolio or the price of gold, but the small guest in the room down the hall. He found her sitting on the edge of the bed, already dressed in the same ragged clothes from the night before, staring out the window at the waking garden. There was a stillness about her, a resignation of someone used to waiting. When he opened the door, she turned, but the terror from before had been replaced by a watchful caution. He had procured new clothes from the housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, a discreet and efficient woman who asked no questions. He left the set on an armchair and told Leah breakfast was waiting. He had to leave for an unavoidable meeting about a new investment fund, but the idea of leaving her alone with Eleanor made him uneasy. His wife's emotional stability was as delicate as her physical condition. When Arthur returned home late that afternoon, an unusual silence hung over the mansion. He found Mrs. Gable in the kitchen, her expression worried. "Mrs. Sterling didn't want any lunch, sir. And the girl, she's been in the missus's room all morning." Arthur's heart froze. He hurried to Eleanor's room, fear pounding in his chest. The door was slightly ajar. He peeked inside, and the scene he witnessed made him stop. His breath caught in his throat. Eleanor was in her wheelchair, as always, near the large window overlooking the garden. But she wasn't looking out. Her eyes were fixed on Leah, who was sitting on the floor at her feet. The girl wasn't playing. With intense concentration, she was holding Eleanor's foot in her small hands, gently moving it, stretching the muscles with a technique that seemed strangely professional. She massaged the calf with her thumbs, applying precise pressure to specific points. Her lips pursed in focus. Eleanor watched, her face a canvas of conflicting emotions. There was surprise, curiosity, and something more. A flicker of interest Arthur hadn't seen in years. He noticed that his wife's leg, usually stiff and lifeless, seemed relaxed under the girl's touch. "What are you doing?" Eleanor asked, her voice a whisper. Leah didn't stop her movements, but answered in the same quiet voice as before. "I'm helping the muscles remember." "Remember what?" Arthur wondered, a chill running down his spine. The scene was as surreal as it was mesmerizing. An 8-year-old girl, found in his garden, performing what looked like a physical therapy session on his wife, who had been paralyzed for 3 years. He backed away silently, closing the door with care so as not to interrupt. A flood of questions washed over him. Who was this girl? Where did this knowledge come from? He spent the rest of the afternoon in his study, unable to concentrate on the performance charts of his investments. The mystery of Leah was more captivating and unsettling than any market fluctuation. As evening fell, he went to check on Eleanor again. He found her asleep in her chair, a small, serene smile on her lips, something he hadn't seen since before the accident. And at her feet, asleep on the rug with her head resting on one of Eleanor's knees, was Leah. The sight of that unexpected peace filled him with an emotion so overwhelming he had to lean against the doorframe to keep from collapsing. But as he looked closer, he noticed something that put him on high alert. Next to Leah's sleeping hand was a small, hardcover notebook, open to a page with detailed anatomical drawings of the human spine. The small hardcover notebook was an anachronistic object in the hands of a child. Arthur approached in silence, his heart hammering. He crouched down, trying not to disturb their serene sleep. The pages were filled with elegant, precise handwriting, clearly an adult's but the drawings were unmistakable. Diagrams of the spinal cord, notes on nerves and muscles, sequences of rehabilitation exercises. They were technical, complex sketches, the kind of material one would expect to find in a specialist's office. Next to a particularly detailed diagram of the lumbar region was a note. Muscle memory persists even when the neural connection is severed. The secret is to reawaken it. Reawaken it. The words echoed in Arthur's mind, connecting with what Leah had told Eleanor. I'm helping the muscles remember. He felt a shiver. That notebook wasn't a toy. It was a manual of advanced knowledge that an 8-year-old girl was somehow applying. In the days that followed, a new, fragile, and quiet routine settled over the Sterling estate. Arthur, torn between his duties, managing a fortune that spanned continents, with investments in a global portfolio, and the need to understand what was happening under his own roof, watched from a distance. Leah spent most of her time with Eleanor. The helping sessions became daily. The girl, with a seriousness that belied her age, guided Eleanor through gentle stretches, teaching her to contract muscles she hadn't felt in years. There was no laughter or trivial conversation. There was a deep concentration, a silent connection between the woman who had lost hope and the child who seemed to carry the weight of ancestral knowledge. Arthur saw the change in his wife. The apathy in her eyes was slowly being replaced by a fierce determination. She started requesting more nutritious meals, reading up on anatomy in the house's vast library. A flame he thought had been extinguished forever had been rekindled. The mystery of Leah, however, deepened. She continued to refuse to speak about her past. Any attempt by Arthur to broach the subject was met with a petrified silence and panic-filled eyes. He decided not to push. For now, Eleanor's well-being was the priority. Even so, he couldn't ignore the danger. Leah had no papers, no official existence. Keeping her there was a legal and social risk. His lawyers, who managed his business affairs and handled his corporate liabilities, warned him of the complications of harboring an unaccompanied minor. But how could he send her away? She was the first drop of rain in a 3-year desert. One afternoon, he entered the solarium where Eleanor and Leah were. The golden late afternoon light flooded the room, illuminating the exotic plants. Leah was standing next to the wheelchair, demonstrating a movement with her arms. Now, breathe deep and try to feel the energy flow down your spine, all the way to the tips of your toes, the girl instructed, her voice calm and confident. Eleanor closed her eyes, her face tight with effort. Arthur watched, fascinated and skeptical. This was language none of the renowned physical therapists he had hired, spending a small fortune on cutting-edge treatments, had ever used. They spoke of nerve impulses, muscle atrophy, grim prognoses. Leah spoke of energy and memory. Suddenly, Eleanor's hand, which was resting on the arm of the chair, twitched. Her fingers curled and uncurled. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, but to Arthur, it was like an earthquake. Eleanor's eyes flew open, gasping, staring at her own hand as if it belonged to someone else. "I felt it," she whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. "Arthur, I felt it." Tears welled in her eyes, the first tears of hope he had seen her shed. Leah just smiled, a small, wise smile, as if she had been expecting exactly that. In that moment, Arthur knew that no matter the risk, he would protect this girl with all his wealth, with all his power. She was more valuable than all the gold in his vaults. But as he moved to embrace his wife, the phone in his pocket vibrated. It was his head of security. The voice on the other end was urgent. "Mr. Sterling, we have a problem. The police are here. They received an anonymous tip about a missing child on your property." The phrase, "the police are here," sounded like a death sentence in the hopeful silence of the solarium. The brief moment of triumph shattered into icy panic. Arthur felt Eleanor's gaze on him, the newborn hope in her eyes quickly being swallowed by fear. Leah, for her part, instantly recoiled, her small body becoming a statue of terror. It was the reaction of someone who knew authority and what it represented all too well: loss, separation. "Stay here," Arthur said, his voice firm despite the storm in his chest. He tried to project a calm he didn't feel, an aura of control he used to close multi-million-dollar deals, but that now felt like flimsy armor. He went downstairs to find two uniformed officers and a severe-looking woman in a grey business suit in the foyer. She introduced herself as Ms. Albright, a social worker from Child Protective Services. "Mr. Sterling," she began, without preamble, her eyes sweeping the luxurious surroundings with an air of disapproval. "We received a report that you are harboring a minor, a runaway from a state institution. Her name is Leah Barnes." The name made her real, official, yanking her from the anonymous refuge of the mansion. Arthur felt his stomach clench. "There's been a misunderstanding," he started, choosing his words with the care of a crisis management expert. "The girl appeared on my property in poor condition. I was merely offering temporary shelter." Miss Albright raised an eyebrow. "Temporary shelter that has now lasted almost a week, sir. Without notifying the proper authorities, the girl absconded from St. Jude's Home for Children. We have to take her back." The mention of the children's home made Leah, who had crept silently down the stairs and was now peeking from behind a marble column, let out a choked gasp. The sound was quiet, but it echoed through the hall like a scream. Everyone turned. Upon seeing the uniforms and the social worker's hard face, Leah took a step back. Panic stamped across her features. "No! Please! Don't take me back there!" Her voice was a desperate plea, breaking the silence she had so long maintained about her past. "It's bad there. They don't take care of you." Miss Albright sighed, a weary, bureaucratic sound. "Every child says that, dear. It's a safe place. Now come along, let's make this easy for everyone." She took a step toward Leah, but Arthur moved, blocking her path. "She isn't going anywhere until my lawyers arrive," he declared, his tone the ice-cold one of a man used to giving orders and being obeyed. He was no longer the worried husband. He was Arthur Sterling, the financial titan, the man whose net worth could buy and sell small companies before breakfast. He was protecting his most precious asset. The police officers exchanged an uneasy glance. The situation escalated quickly. While Arthur was on the phone with his legal team, Eleanor came down in the house elevator, positioning her wheelchair beside Leah in a silent, powerful gesture of protection. The arrival of the lawyers turned the mansion's foyer into a makeshift negotiation room. Terms like temporary custody, guardianship petition, and institutional negligence investigation were thrown back and forth. In the middle of it all, Leah trembled, clinging to Eleanor's wheelchair like a life raft. Miss Albright, pressured by Arthur's formidable legal team, agreed to delay the girl's removal until a preliminary hearing could be scheduled, but she left a clear warning. "The system doesn't favor impromptu solutions, Mr. Sterling. The law is clear. She belongs to an institution." When they finally left, a heavy silence settled over the house. The threat hadn't passed. It was merely hovering, waiting. Later that night, Arthur found Leah in the garden, sitting in the same spot where he had first discovered her. She was looking up at the stars, her face pale in the moonlight. "My grandma's up there," she said, without turning. She was a physical therapist, One of the best. She taught me everything, said I had the gift in my hands. For the first time, she was speaking of her past. She developed these different techniques for people who couldn't walk anymore. She said that hope was the first muscle you had to exercise. Arthur sat beside her on the damp grass. The revelation was stunning, a crucial piece of the puzzle. Why did you run away from the children's home, Leah? Leah finally turned to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Because they took Grandma's notebooks. They said it was nonsense, and they were going to throw them all away. It was all I had left of her. It was the inheritance she left me. Leah's confession, delivered with the devastating simplicity of childhood, reframed the entire situation for Arthur. This was no longer just about protecting a scared child. It was about safeguarding a legacy. The notebooks weren't just notes. They were the inheritance of a life dedicated to healing, a treasure of knowledge that ignorant bureaucrats were about to destroy. Arthur's determination, once fueled by hope for Eleanor's recovery, now burned with a sense of justice. Protecting Leah meant protecting her grandmother's work, knowledge that could revolutionize countless lives, just as it was beginning to transform his own. The following morning, the mood in the mansion was one of tense calm. The threat of the custody hearing loomed over them, a dark cloud on the horizon. Arthur mobilized his legal team, instructing them to investigate St. Jude's Home for Children thoroughly. He wanted to know everything, its history, its finances, any registered complaints. If there was neglect, he would find it. The wealth he had accumulated, which often felt like an abstract burden of numbers on a screen, now had a visceral purpose. Meanwhile, a new and unexpected obstacle emerged from a source Arthur would never have imagined: the medical community. Eleanor's progress, though slow, was undeniable. She could now wiggle her toes and feel brief tingling sensations in her legs, sensations doctors had declared impossible. Excited, Arthur had shared this news with Dr. Evans, Eleanor's neurologist, a renowned but conservative man. The reaction was not what he had hoped for. The doctor, instead of celebrating, expressed a cold skepticism. "Arthur, I understand your optimism, but we must be realistic," he said during a tense phone call. "These techniques from an untrained child are, at best, a placebo effect. At worst, they could be dangerous. Improper stimulation can cause permanent damage." The doctor's words were a bucket of cold water. He dismissed Leah's knowledge as unconventional and refused to endorse any treatment that didn't follow established protocols. Dr. Evans's skepticism was more than a professional opinion. It was a barrier. Without the support of a medical authority, his fight for Leah's custody would become even more difficult. The social worker could easily argue that he was subjecting his wife to risky practices influenced by a child. The situation grew more complicated when, a few days later, the housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, entered Arthur's study, her face pale. "Sir, there's a man at the gate. He says he's the girl's uncle." Arthur felt his blood run cold. Uncle. Leah had never mentioned any other family. He went to the main gate, apprehension growing with each step. The man waiting for him was thin and unkempt, with small, shrewd eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they saw. He introduced himself as Jonas, the brother of Leah's deceased father. "I heard my niece was here," he said, an oily smile spreading across his lips. "I've come to get her. After all, I'm the only family she's got." The arrival of Jonas was a disaster. A blood relative would have priority in custody, trumping any petition Arthur could file, but something about the man's demeanor, his eagerness and his greedy gaze, set off an alarm in Arthur's mind. He didn't seem driven by familial concern. He seemed driven by opportunity. Arthur invited him in, maintaining his composure while discreetly instructing his head of security to run a full background check on Jonas. In the living room, the man couldn't hide his awe at the wealth around him. His eyes gleamed at the paintings, the furniture, the quiet luxury. "So, Leah's been here helping your wife, has she?" he asked casually. I hear the girl has a special talent inherited from her grandmother, a talent that could be worth a lot of money. The statement confirmed Arthur's worst suspicions. Jonas didn't want Leah. He wanted to exploit her gift. He saw the girl not as a niece, but as an asset, a winning lottery ticket. The battle for the girl had just gained a new and dangerous adversary, one who would use blood ties as a weapon. And to make matters worse, as they spoke, Arthur's phone buzzed with a message from his lawyer. The investigation into the children's home turned something up. Several children have run away in recent years, citing neglect. All were forced to return by the system. The place has a disturbing record. The grim revelation added another layer of urgency. Leah could not go back to St. Jude's, and she certainly couldn't fall into this man's hands. Arthur was surrounded, the challenges multiplying, and the future of the girl, and the hope of his wife, hung by an ever-thinning thread. The tension in the living room was so palpable, Arthur could feel it as a physical pressure in his chest. Jonas, the supposed uncle, continued to talk about Leah's talent, painting scenarios of exclusive clinics and wealthy clients, shamelessly revealing his greed. Every word was a knife in Arthur's heart. He needed to buy time. With a calculated coldness, the same he used to destabilize competitors at a negotiation table. Arthur cut off Jonas's monologue. Any discussion about Leah's custody, he corrected himself, will be handled through legal channels. My lawyers will be in contact with you. He stood, signaling the end of the conversation. Jonas, caught off guard by the abrupt dismissal, stammered for a moment before his oily smile returned. As you wish, Mr. Sterling. But blood is thicker than water. The law is on my side. He left, leaving a trail of veiled threat behind him. Arthur knew the man wouldn't give up easily. He was a vulture who had scented a valuable prize. In the days that followed, the mansion transformed into a strategic command center. Lawyers came and went, private investigators were hired, and confidential reports on Jonas Barnes and St. Jude's Home for Children piled up on Arthur's desk. The findings were disturbing. Jonas had a history of petty scams and debt, a man living on the margins, always looking for the easy way out. The children's home, meanwhile, was run with criminal inefficiency, with funds being misappropriated and an environment of apathy and hopelessness that perfectly explained Leah's desperation to escape. While the legal battle was being mounted, the emotional pressure inside the house intensified. Eleanor, for the first time since the accident, had a taste of hope, and the fear of losing it made her fragile and irritable. She clung to her physical progress like a castaway to a piece of driftwood, and the thought of losing Leah, the source of this miracle, was terrifying. She vacillated between moments of intense determination during her exercises and fits of silent weeping at night. Arthur felt helpless, capable of moving financial markets, but unable to soothe his wife's anguish. Leah, on the other hand, seemed to retreat into her own world. The menacing presence of Jonas and the prospect of a court hearing had traumatized her. She continued to help Eleanor, but her spontaneity was gone, replaced by a mechanical precision. The light in her eyes had dimmed. She was physically present, but her spirit seemed to have withdrawn to a safe, unreachable place. The turning point, the moment that irrevocably altered the course of events, came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, exactly 1 week after the meeting with Jonas. Arthur was at the office, on a conference call with investors in Hong Kong, when his private line rang with the mansion's number. It was Mrs. Gable. Her voice choked with panic. "Sir, come home now. It's Mrs. Sterling." He dropped everything, his heart racing, his mind flooded with the worst possible images. He drove home, breaking every traffic law, fear a bitter taste in his mouth. When he burst through the front door, he found Mrs. Gable and one of the gardeners in the hall, their faces pale with shock. They pointed toward the living room. Arthur ran, bracing himself for the worst, and then he stopped, frozen in the doorway. The scene before him defied all logic, all the reality he had known for the past 3 years. Eleanor was not in her wheelchair. She was standing, alone, in the middle of the room. Her legs were shaking violently, her body slick with the sweat of a superhuman effort. She was bracing herself with one hand on the back of a sofa, the other extended in front of her for balance. A few feet away, her back to the door, was Leah, encouraging her in a low, firm voice. "Just one more step, Eleanor. You can do it. Remember what Grandma said. The body hears what the mind believes." And then, before Arthur's disbelieving eyes, Eleanor let go of the sofa. For a second, she wavered, her body swaying precariously. But then, she planted her feet, and she took a step, a hesitant, shuffling, but definite step. And then another. She walked, trembling and unsteady, the 2 yards that separated her from Leah, before collapsing into the girl's arms, both of them tumbling onto the soft rug in an embrace of exhaustion and triumph. Arthur felt hot tears streaming down his face, uncontrollably. They were tears of shock, of relief, of a joy so intense it was painful. But amidst his overwhelming emotion, a terrifying question rose in his mind. If Leah could do this, what else was possible? And why was Eleanor's accident, which every expert had deemed permanent, being reversed by a child? The echo of Eleanor's faltering steps reverberated through the mansion, not just as sound, but as a shockwave that redefined the impossible. The image of her standing, followed by the soft fall into Leah's arms, was seared into Arthur's mind, an indelible photograph of a miracle. He took a moment to compose himself, to turn tears of shock into action. He helped Eleanor back into her chair, her body trembling with exhaustion, but her eyes shining with a light he thought he would never see again. It was the light of victory. "I did it, Arthur," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I walked." He kissed her forehead, his heart overflowing with a mixture of euphoria and a growing fear. The miracle was undeniable, but it was also evidence. Dangerous evidence of the power contained in Leah's knowledge. A power men like Jonas wanted to exploit, and institutions like Dr. Evans's wanted to discredit. Eleanor's achievement, however, deepened the relationships within the house in complex ways. Her reliance on Leah was no longer just physical, but profoundly emotional. She saw the girl not as a child to be protected, but as her savior, her guardian angel. This adoration, while understandable, placed immense pressure on Leah's small shoulders. Arthur watched them together, the complicity between them palpable. Leah was no longer just a guest. She was the gravitational center around which the family's hope now revolved. Arthur's relationship with Eleanor also transformed. The guilt that had haunted him, the sense that he had failed to protect her, began to recede, replaced by a renewed admiration for her strength. He watched her fight, watched her sweat and struggle every day, and he fell in love with her all over again, not with the woman she was before the accident, but with the warrior she had become. While the emotional dynamics inside the mansion deepened, the outside world grew increasingly hostile. The news of Eleanor's miraculous progress, whispered by house staff, inevitably leaked. First, it was a blind item in a gossip column, then a speculative article on a news portal. The story of a mysterious girl healing the paralyzed wife of billionaire Arthur Sterling was irresistible. This attracted unwanted media attention and, worse, intensified the scrutiny from the authorities. Ms. Albright, the social worker, requested a psychological evaluation of Leah and an unannounced home visit, arguing that the girl was being subjected to undue performance pressure. Jonas, the uncle, used the publicity to his advantage, giving interviews to tabloids, painting himself as a concerned relative fighting to rescue his niece from the clutches of an eccentric millionaire who was exploiting her. He was building a public narrative that favored him, making Arthur's legal battle even steeper. The biggest challenge, however, came from a completely unexpected direction. During routine research for the custody case, one of Arthur's investigators discovered a seemingly insignificant detail about Eleanor's accident. The accident occurred when scaffolding from a nearby construction site collapsed onto her car. At the time, it was ruled a tragic accident, a freak occurrence. The construction company responsible, Imperial Construction, paid a substantial settlement, closing the case. Arthur, devastated at the time, had accepted the deal to avoid a prolonged court battle. Now, the investigator found something new. Imperial Construction, the same company from the accident, was facing multiple lawsuits for negligence and use of substandard materials on other projects. The discovery was like a lightning strike. Arthur had never connected the dots. His mind, trained to see patterns in stock markets and cash flow, began working furiously. Why would a company with a history of negligence have its case settled so quickly? Was the settlement a way to buy his silence, to prevent a deeper investigation that could expose systemic failures and cost them a fortune in other lawsuits? The suspicion cast a new, sinister light on everything. And then came the connection that made him gasp. In one of Imperial Construction's financial reports, a consulting payment caught the investigator's eye. The recipient of the payment, made a few weeks prior, was a man named Jonas Barnes, Leah's uncle. The revelation was devastating. It was no coincidence. The company responsible for his wife's paralysis was now, somehow, linked to the man trying to take Leah from his home. The battle for the girl's custody wasn't just about family or institutional neglect. There was something much larger and darker at play. Suddenly, Arthur realized he wasn't just fighting for a child and his wife's recovery. He had stumbled into a conspiracy, and Leah, with her miraculous gift, was, for some terrible reason, the key to it all. The discovery of the link between Imperial Construction and Jonas Barnes was like a key turning in a secret lock, opening a door to a dark and threatening corridor. Arthur felt a chill run down his spine, the kind he got when a promising investment turned out to be a well-architected fraud. The consulting payment was clearly a bribe. The company that had crippled his wife was funding the man who wanted to take away her only hope of healing. The question was, why? What did Imperial Construction fear so much that they would get involved in a custody dispute? The answer, he suspected, lay in the notebooks of Leah's grandmother and in Eleanor's progress. If the girl's techniques could prove that Eleanor's condition was not permanent, it could reopen the accident case. The freak occurrence would become a case of negligence with ongoing, recoverable damages, exposing the company to a lawsuit of astronomical value, far greater than the initial settlement. Worse, it could set a precedent for other victims. They didn't want to silence Leah. They wanted to remove her from the equation before her miracle became evidence in court. The realization of this new threat changed Arthur's strategy. He was now fighting on two fronts: the public battle for Leah's custody and a secret war against a powerful, unscrupulous corporation. He moved a significant portion of his capital into more liquid funds, preparing for a long and costly legal fight. His lawyers began quietly gathering every piece of information they could on Imperial Construction, its executives, and its other lawsuits. It was a dangerous game. He was going up against a company that would not hesitate to use its power and wealth to crush him. Meanwhile, the pressure on Leah became unbearable. The girl, gifted with a keen intuition, sensed the tension in the house. She saw the lawyers, heard Arthur's urgent phone calls, and noticed Eleanor's worried glances. The world of adults, with its laws, money, and secrets, was closing in around her. The weight of being Eleanor's hope, the centerpiece of a legal dispute, and the target of a sinister corporation was too much for an 8-year-old to bear. The breaking point came during an exercise session. Eleanor, frustrated with her slow progress that day, pushed herself too hard and nearly fell. "I need to get better faster, Leah. The hearing is coming up," she said, her voice fraught with desperation. It wasn't an accusation, but to Leah it sounded like one. It was the pressure of having to perform a miracle on demand. The girl recoiled, her eyes wide and frightened. She shook her head and, for the first time, said, "No, I can't," she whispered. "It's too much." She turned and fled to her room, locking the door. And then silence. A deep, frightening silence. Leah stopped talking, completely. She wouldn't respond to anyone, not to Arthur, not even to Eleanor. She refused to leave her room except to eat, and spent hours sitting by the window, staring at nothing. The physical therapy sessions stopped. Eleanor's progress stalled. The light that had returned to the mansion began to fade. Leah's relapse triggered a devastating crisis in Eleanor. The loss of physical progress was a hard blow, but the loss of her connection with the girl was what broke her. The hope that had sustained her turned to despair. She saw Leah's silence as a punishment, a reflection of her own impatience. The wheelchair, which had begun to seem like a relic of the past, was once again a prison. She refused to leave her room, mirroring Leah's behavior. The mansion, which for a few weeks had been a place of rebirth, became a mausoleum of lost hopes. Arthur found himself trapped between two silent pains, trying to mend two broken souls. He tried everything. He hired a renowned child psychologist, but Leah refused to engage. He tried to talk to Eleanor, but she pushed him away. Lost in her own guilt and sorrow, the fortune he commanded, the assets he owned, were useless. He couldn't buy Leah's peace of mind or restore his wife's faith. He was failing again, and the weight of that failure was crushing. One night, desperate, he went to Leah's room. The door was unlocked. He found her asleep, her face tear-stained. Beside her on the bed were her grandmother's notebooks, lying open. He picked one up carefully. On one of the first pages, in a childish, wavering script, Leah had written, "Grandma says healing isn't just fixing bones, it's fixing trust. If the person doesn't believe they can get well, no technique will work." Arthur closed the notebook, the truth of those words hitting him with the force of a punch. It wasn't the technique that had failed, it was trust, and he didn't know how to rebuild it. The words in Leah's notebook were a beacon in the darkness that had engulfed the mansion. Healing is fixing trust. Arthur realized that in his rush to fight legal and corporate battles, he had neglected the most important war, the one being waged within the souls of Eleanor and Leah. He had focused on the external obstacles, the greedy uncle, the bureaucratic system, the corrupt company, and forgotten that the deepest wounds are not visible. Eleanor hadn't just lost movement. She had lost faith in her own body. Leah wasn't just scared of being taken away. She was terrified by the responsibility of being someone's only source of hope. They were both paralyzed, each in their own way, by fear. That night, Arthur made a decision. He would suspend the legal offensive for a moment and focus on rebuilding the foundation of trust that had crumbled. His first step was toward Eleanor. He entered her room, where she sat in her wheelchair, watching the rain beat against the window pane. A mirror image of her own desolation, he knelt before her, taking her cold hands. "My love," he began, his voice thick with the emotion he usually kept under control. "I made a mistake. We all did. We were so focused on you walking that we forgot what really matters. We put an impossible burden on a child." Eleanor began to cry, silent sobs that shook her body. "It's my fault, Arthur. I pushed her. I broke her." "No," he said firmly. "It's no one's fault. It's just pain. But we can't let it win. Leah doesn't need to be our healer. She just needs to be a kid. And you don't need to walk to be the woman I love. I love you now, exactly as you are." His simple, sincere words were the first crack in the wall of despair Eleanor had built around herself. He wasn't demanding a miracle from her. He was offering unconditional love. The next, and harder, step was reaching Leah. He knew words wouldn't be enough. He needed an action, a gesture that would show her she was more than her gift, that she was loved for who she was. He spent the entire night in his study, not analyzing market reports, but poring over the notebooks of Leah's grandmother. He didn't understand the technical terms, but he understood the philosophy behind them, the connection between mind and body, the importance of environment and inner peace. The next morning, he went to Leah's door and, instead of asking her to come out, he entered with a breakfast tray and one of the notebooks. He sat on the floor, at a respectful distance, and began to read aloud. Not the exercise instructions, but the personal notes the grandmother had written in the margins. They were reflections on patience, on the beauty of small victories, on how every patient was a unique journey. Leah watched him, silent, her eyes wary. He did this for 3 days. He asked nothing of her. He just shared her grandmother's words, building a bridge from the past she cherished to the present that terrified her. On the third afternoon, as he read about how the grandmother used soft music to help patients relax, Leah whispered her first word in over a week. Piano. It was almost inaudible, but to Arthur it sounded like a symphony. That night, he had the grand piano in the music room tuned for the first time in 3 years. He found old sheet music for simple classical pieces. The next morning, he sat at the piano and, with clumsy fingers, began to play a simple, hesitant melody. The sound echoed through the silent house. Minutes later, Leah appeared at the door of the music room, drawn by the sound. She said nothing, just stood there, listening. The next day, Eleanor, moved by a curiosity that overcame her apathy, also appeared, positioning her wheelchair near the door. The music, imperfect as it was bringing them together again, creating a safe space where there were no expectations, only notes floating on the air. The real turning point, however, came from an external source. Arthur's lawyer called, his voice tense. "Arthur, I have terrible news. Imperial Construction found out about our investigation. They're counterattacking. They've filed a motion to expedite Leah's custody hearing, and simultaneously, they're filing a defamation suit against you, claiming you're trying to tarnish their name to renegotiate the accident settlement. They're cornering us." The news was a blow, but one that, paradoxically, solidified Arthur's resolve. The threat was no longer abstract. It was imminent and brutal. He realized the time for healing emotional wounds was running out. He had to fight, but this time he wouldn't fight alone. That night, he gathered Eleanor and, with Leah sitting nearby, he explained the situation, not hiding its severity. "They want to take Leah from us, so the truth about your accident never comes out," he said, looking at his wife. "They think that by dividing us, they can beat us." Eleanor looked at Leah, whose silence had been broken, but whose voice was still a fragile thread. "They don't know who they're messing with," Eleanor said. And for the first time, there was no fear in her voice, only steel. She turned to Leah. "Honey, we don't need you to fix us. We need you to be brave with us. Can you do that?" Leah looked from Eleanor to Arthur, seeing in them no longer patients or guardians, but allies. She nodded slowly, a small but definitive movement, and then she spoke, her voice clear and firm. Grandma had one last notebook, the most important one. Jonas took it. It's the one where she explains how their negligence caused damage that could be reversed. "And I know exactly where he hid it." Leah's revelation about the lost notebook was like a sunbeam piercing the storm. It was the missing piece, the smoking gun that could not only ensure Leah stayed with them, but also expose Imperial Construction's entire conspiracy. The notebook didn't just contain physical therapy techniques, it held the key to justice. The atmosphere in the mansion changed instantly. Apathy and sorrow were replaced by a focused, urgent energy. They were no longer passive victims of circumstance. They were a team on a critical mission. Arthur immediately summoned his head of security and his lead private investigator. In the makeshift war room of his study, the stock market charts forgotten on the screens, Leah, perched on a chair far too big for her, described Jonas's hiding place. He lived in a small room behind an auto body shop. There was a loose floorboard under his bed. He kept his important things there because he thought no one would ever look in such a dirty place. The description, coming from a child, was precise and clear. She had absorbed details even in the midst of her fear. Arthur realized the depth of this girl's resilience. She wasn't just gifted, she was a survivor. The operation to retrieve the notebook was planned with the precision of a hostile corporate takeover. They couldn't just break in. That would make the evidence inadmissible in court. They needed a legal, discreet approach. Arthur's investigator, a shrewd ex-cop, found out Jonas was about to be evicted for non-payment of rent. Using this information, the legal team secured a court order to seize the landlord's property, which would give them legal access to the room at the exact moment Jonas was served notice. It was a risky maneuver, a race against time. While the operation was underway, the tension in the mansion peaked. The custody hearing was set for a few days. Time and Imperial Construction's lawsuit hung over them like a sword. Eleanor, however, thrived under the pressure. The fight for Leah and for justice gave her a purpose that transcended her own physical recovery. She spent hours with the lawyers, recalling details from the day of the accident, her memory sharpened by adrenaline. She and Leah began working together again, but the dynamic was different. It was no longer patient and healer. It was two partners, preparing for the battle of their lives. They didn't focus on taking steps, but on strengthening Eleanor's core muscles, on building her stamina. "You don't have to run a marathon," Leah would say, repeating one of her grandmother's mantras. "You just have to stand long enough for your voice to be heard." The news came on a cold night. The investigator called. "We got it, Mr. Sterling. The notebook was exactly where the girl said it would be." The relief was immense, but short-lived. As they examined the contents, they realized the magnitude of what they held. The notebook was a detailed clinical journal. Leah's grandmother, the renowned Dr. Helena Barnes, had been informally consulted by an engineer from Imperial Construction months before Eleanor's accident. The engineer was concerned about the quality of materials used in several projects. Dr. Barnes, after analyzing stress reports on the scaffolding materials, predicted the possibility of collapses and described in precise clinical detail the exact type of spinal cord injury a victim might suffer in such an event. She went further. She developed a preemptive treatment protocol, arguing that with the right, immediate rehabilitation, the paralysis from this type of impact could be, in many cases, reversible. The company ignored her. Worse, they threatened her with legal action if she went public with her concerns, accusing her of trying to damage their reputation. The notebook was the irrefutable proof. Imperial Construction hadn't just been negligent, they knew the risk, ignored the warnings, and later knew Eleanor's condition might not be permanent. Yet they chose to pay a settlement to silence the case. They had condemned her to a wheelchair for profit. The discovery was both devastating and empowering. Arthur felt a surge of fury unlike any he had ever known. This wasn't about money or business. It was about calculated cruelty, the dehumanization of his wife for the sake of a bottom line. The battle was now personal. He picked up the phone and called his lead counsel. "Forget the defense," he said, his voice as cold as ice. "I want you to prepare the largest lawsuit for punitive damages and criminal negligence this country has ever seen. We're going to use this notebook not just to keep Leah with us, but to bring them down, piece by piece." War had been declared, and the battlefield would be a courtroom. The future of everyone, Leah, Eleanor, Arthur himself, and a billion-dollar corporation, would be decided in a single hearing. The anteroom of the courthouse was a vacuum of silence and cold air conditioning. Each tick of the clock on the wall was like a hammer blow, measuring the seconds that separated them from the moment that would define their futures. Arthur, Eleanor, and Leah sat together, a small triangle of solidarity in the midst of the law's impersonal chill. Arthur, impeccable in his dark suit, could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, a wild rhythm that betrayed his calm exterior. He looked at Eleanor, seated beside him in her wheelchair, not with the fragility of before, but with the regal posture of a queen about to enter battle. Her eyes were fixed ahead, filled with a steely resolve, and Leah, between them, held Eleanor's hand tightly, her small face pale and serious but tearless. She had become a little warrior, ready to face giants. Across the hall, they could see the opposition. Uncle Jonas, looking uncomfortable in an ill-fitting suit, flanked by an expensive-looking lawyer, obviously paid for by Imperial Construction. Further back, a group of the company's executives, their faces impassive, watched it all, exuding an air of power and arrogance. When the courtroom doors opened, the air seemed to thin. The judge, a grey-haired man with a stern expression, entered, and the silence became absolute. The hearing began, a whirlwind of legal jargon and formal procedure. Jonas's lawyer spoke first, painting a picture of a loving uncle trying to rescue his niece from an unstable and exploitative environment. He used the publicity, Arthur's wealth, and the unconventional treatment methods as weapons, trying to portray Leah as a victim. Next, Ms. Albright, the social worker, gave her testimony, recommending, based on protocol, that Leah be returned to a state institution until the uncle's custody could be formally established. Every word was a blow, an attempt to dismantle the small family they had formed. Arthur felt the rage building inside him, a helpless fury as the gears of bureaucracy tried to crush them. When it was his lawyer's turn, the climate in the room began to shift. He presented the evidence of the children's home's neglect, the reports on Jonas's dubious character, and finally introduced Dr. Helena Barnes's notebook as evidence. The defense for Imperial Construction, present as an interested party, objected vehemently, but the judge, intrigued, allowed it. Arthur's lawyer read excerpts from the notebook, his calm, firm voice echoing through the court. He read about the ignored warnings, the prediction of the accident, and most crucially, the possibility of recovery. A murmur rippled through the room. The Imperial executives exchanged nervous glances. Jonas began to sweat visibly, but the real bombshell was yet to come. "Your Honor," Arthur's lawyer said, "we have one final witness. We would like to call Mrs. Eleanor Sterling to the stand." Imperial's lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection! Mrs. Sterling is medically incapacitated. Her testimony would be emotionally compromised and irrelevant to the matter of custody." The judge looked at Eleanor, an expression of pity on his face. "Given Mrs. Sterling's condition," he began, but he was cut off, not by a lawyer, but by Eleanor herself. "I can testify." "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the courtroom air. All eyes turned to her, and then the climax of 5 weeks of pain, fear, and hope unfolded. Slowly, with an effort that made every muscle in her body tremble, Eleanor placed her hands on the arms of her wheelchair. She took a deep breath, her eyes locked on the judge. Arthur held his breath, his heart stopped in his chest. Leah squeezed her eyes shut, her small hands clasped as if in prayer. With a groan of exertion, Eleanor pushed. Her body rose, wavering, unstable. She steadied herself, her legs shaking violently, and then she was standing alone, before the court, before her enemies, before the world. She let go of the chair and, steadying herself with one hand on the wooden witness stand before her, she spoke, her voice ringing with the force of thunder. "The miracle this little girl performed is not just in my legs, Your Honor. It's in the truth she helped me find, and that truth deserves to be heard." The silence in the courtroom was absolute, broken only by the gasping breath of a woman who, against all odds, had just stood up to fight. Eleanor's act of standing was more powerful than any legal argument. It was a living, irrefutable testimony that silenced objections and dismantled narratives. The judge, the lawyers, everyone in the room stared at her, no longer as a victim in a wheelchair, but as a force of nature. The look of shock on the faces of the Imperial Construction executives was the first crack in their armor of arrogance. Jonas Barnes shrank in his seat, looking suddenly small and pathetic. Leaning on the stand, Eleanor told her story. Her voice, though trembling from the physical effort, was unwavering. She spoke not with anger or self-pity, but with the clarity of someone who had walked through hell and back. She described the darkness of despair, the spark Leah had ignited, and the slow, painful journey back to life. Then, with the help of Arthur's lawyer, she connected her personal recovery to the corporate conspiracy, using the notes from Dr. Barnes's notebook to explain how the company's negligence had sentenced her to a prison that should never have existed. Eleanor's testimony lasted nearly an hour. When she finished, exhausted, Arthur helped her back into her chair, but the power dynamic in the courtroom had been forever altered. The judge, visibly moved and impressed, dismissed Jonas's custody motion and granted Arthur and Eleanor immediate temporary guardianship of Leah with a clear path to permanent adoption. It was the first and most important victory. The family they had formed was safe, but the battle wasn't over. The revelation of the notebook and Eleanor's testimony opened the floodgates to a scandal of massive proportions. In the days following the hearing, the story exploded in the media. The image of Eleanor Sterling standing in court went viral. Imperial Construction's name was dragged through the mud. The company's stock plummeted, and the district attorney's office opened a criminal investigation for negligence and fraud. The corporation, in desperation, tried to fight back. They threatened Arthur with countersuits, tried to discredit the memory of Dr. Barnes, but it was too late. Their house of cards was collapsing. Victims from other accidents began to come forward, emboldened by Eleanor's courage. The engineer who had warned Dr. Barnes years ago, now retired and guilt-ridden, came to Arthur's lawyers to corroborate the story, providing internal documents he had saved for years. It was the final blow. Facing overwhelming evidence and public pressure, the board of Imperial Construction resigned, and the company was forced into a massive settlement, not just with the Sterlings, but with dozens of other victims. Arthur directed every cent of their portion of the settlement to create a foundation. The Helena Barnes Foundation was born, with a mission to provide innovative rehabilitation treatments based on the notebook's techniques to people with spinal cord injuries who couldn't afford them. The second victory, seeing justice prevail and Leah's grandmother's legacy honored, brought a deep sense of purpose to his life. The money that was once just a number had become a tool for hope. While the external conflicts resolved, the internal healing continued. Safe in her new home, Leah blossomed. The serious, frightened girl gave way to a bright, curious child who filled the mansion with laughter. She never lost her innate wisdom, but she now balanced it with the lightness of childhood. She started school, made friends, and discovered the joy of simply being a girl. Eleanor, meanwhile, continued her recovery. Aided by a team of doctors now eager to learn and apply Dr. Barnes's techniques, she made great strides. She traded the wheelchair for crutches, and months later, took her first fully independent steps in the very garden where it all began. The final victory was not in lawsuits or financial settlements. It came on a sunny Sunday as Arthur watched from the veranda while Eleanor and Leah ran hand in hand across the grass, their shared laughter echoing in the air. The family he had built on a foundation of fear and pain had been rebuilt on a bedrock of love, resilience, and a miracle that had arrived in the form of a tiny trespasser on a foggy night. The narrative arcs of suffering and recovery had closed, not with an end, but with a bright, new beginning. 5 weeks. It felt like a lifetime. Arthur stood on the same veranda where, just 35 days ago, he had watched the fog swallow his world, feeling like a prisoner in his own gilded cage. Now, the morning sun bathed the gardens in a clear, golden light, and the fog, both outside and in his soul, had lifted. He watched the scene on the lawn below, a genuine, serene smile on his face. Eleanor, wearing a light dress that danced in the breeze, was kneeling, helping Leah plant a new row of daisies near the old garden shed. The shed, once a symbol of neglect, had been refurbished. Painted white with blue trim, it was now Leah's playhouse, a small sanctuary of joy where only rust and shadows had been before. Leah's laughter, crystalline and free, was the mansion's new soundtrack, a melody that had silenced the echoes of pain. The journey had been a whirlwind. The courtroom victories and the creation of the foundation were important milestones, but the real transformation had happened in the quiet moments of everyday life. It happened on the nights the three of them read stories together, huddled on the couch. It happened over breakfasts filled with trivial chatter and dinners where the silence was no longer heavy, but comfortable. They had become a family, not by blood ties or court order, but by a mutual choice to heal one another. Arthur's fortune, his assets and businesses continued to thrive, but his definition of wealth had changed forever. Wealth was not his portfolio's balance or his stock tickers. It was the warmth of Eleanor's hand in his, the sparkle in Leah's eyes as she told him about her school day, the peace that had finally settled in his own heart. That morning, Eleanor stood up, brushing the dirt from her hands, and walked over to him on the veranda. She moved with a fluidity that still astonished him, a grace won back with sweat and courage. She hugged him, resting her head on his chest. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. "I was thinking," he answered, "in that I spent years building an empire to protect us from anything the world could throw at us. I amassed a huge amount of capital, diversified investments, considered every liability. But the one thing that actually saved us didn't come from my treasury. It slipped through a hole in the fence." Eleanor smiled, looking down at Leah, who was now chasing a butterfly. Sometimes the greatest assets can't be quantified, and the highest return comes from an investment in someone else's heart. The Helena Barnes Foundation was already making a difference. The revolutionary techniques, once dismissed as unconventional, were being studied and adopted by rehabilitation centers around the world. The legacy of Leah's grandmother, which had nearly been thrown away, was now giving hope back to thousands. Leah, while aware of the importance of her grandmother's work, was happy to let others lead it. Her gift remained in her hands, but she now used it to fix her friends' scraped knees or to massage Arthur's shoulders after a long day. The man who had felt guilty for his wife's paralysis had discovered that true healing wasn't about erasing the past, but building a new future from its broken pieces. The wife who believed she was condemned to stillness learned that the most powerful strength lies not in muscles, but in the ability to believe again. And the child who had nowhere to sleep became the compass that guided a lost family back home. Later, the three of them walked hand in hand through the garden. As they passed the shed, Leah stopped and pointed to the new daisies. Grandma used to say that flowers are proof that even after the darkest winter, life always finds a way to bloom again. Arthur looked at Eleanor, then at Leah, and knew that those words were the deepest truth of all. They had survived their winter, and now, under the warm sun, it was time to bloom.